Welcome to Lancefield on the Line. I'm so happy to welcome the legend that is Dan Cable, the author of the eponymous book, exceptional guru of all things psychology and workforce culture, and professor of organizational behavior at the London Business School. You are also, as you know, Dan, the co-host with Akin Omobitten of the podcast Squeezing the Orange of Social Science, which is insightful, very relevant, and hilarious most often. So it's a great something I'd highly recommend, and I listen to regularly. So welcome to the show, Dan.
Thanks for the nice introduction.
Pleasure. I'm going to talk today about hybrid working, playing to our strengths, exceptional performance, of course. Might also talk about you and your own habits. Do you practice what you preach? Always a good one to start and end with. But
hypocrisy is so much fun, isn't it, David?
Right. Let's just get. I love your disclosure in your book, which I've loved reading an early copy of and have used in all the exercises in it. But you do disclose more than others professionally and personally. Yeah. So hypocrisy wasn't one of those things you disclosed, but it was a wonderful read, and I highly recommend it. So let's talk about the pandemic. I mean, wherever you are in the world, it's caused many of us to sort of revisit how we live and work. Some of it forced, some of it through sort of self-awareness, through prompts in our life. The question I ask you is, based on your research and your work with leaders across the world, how do they get the good stuff to stick as we come out, hopefully, of the pandemic?
Yeah, some of it's recognizing the good stuff too, because I'm sure you've seen this in your own research and talking to people, but there's just a lot of leaders that, want to go back to 2019, and I don't think they're wanting to hear it. I don't think they're wanting to see that there is good stuff. And boy, there's a great conversation there around what that is driven by. But for the most part, they're seeing it's not an option anymore. They're seeing that even if they don't see that as flexible and adaptable and showing real resilience, what we've learned about our ability to work in very different ways. I mean, what a moment, David. Like, I like starting here because if we just take a step back, you can say it's a lot of work and churn to try to make all this, happen. But we're living in an enormously cool time right now, where since like the 1900s, when we decided like we were going to put people in rooms all at the same time, and we got trains to run at the same times to get them there, and punching clocks, we've kind of been working that way for 100 and some years.
Absolutely.
And we're finally shattering that and saying, like, we may not have to do it that way. How to make it stick, though? That's your real question. Well, there's a couple of different ideas. I'm actually doing a research project I could tell you about right now. But before I do that, because I don't want to just like eat it up if that's not where you want to go with it, I think the way to make it stick is this learning orientation, this whole way of leaders and employees, just everybody looking at what we've done over the last 18 months and saying, what can we learn? What didn't go well? What are the things that we never thought that we could do, even in a decade? Some of this work from home stuff, firms have been toying around with this and kicking it as a ball for a decade. Then all of a sudden, bam, you have 3 months, go. And we did it.
Absolutely right. Absolutely. Go on, tell us about the research project. Go on, let's go there. Yeah, as well.
Yeah, okay, I'll give you 3 minutes on it, and then you decide if you want more. There was a lot of burnout. We were working with a company called Upfield, and they're a spinoff of Unilever. And they're just working the way so many firms are, kind of nonstop. They're just sort of all in, these employees, and they were really starting to get burnout after 7 months, and then 10 months, and then 15 months of this. So we instituted this field experiment where half the people got to do this thing where on a Monday, they took an hour and they just looked over the span of the next week and said, what do I have to do that's urgent? What are the fires that have to be fought? And what do I have to do that's important? What's the most value that I can bring to the party? What's the unique thing that I can do to add the most to this company? And so then Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, they put 2 hours in their calendar, blocked it off to do deep work, to do the stuff that they thought was most important. And I'll tell you, it was hard, by the way. Lots of bosses who said, let's do this study. We need to be able to manage urgent and important. they couldn't let it go. They couldn't not be urgent. They couldn't not get on the phone. They couldn't knock, on people's electronic door and say, I actually need you now. Like, why aren't you responding? But for the bosses that allowed that to unfold, we reduced emotional labor and burnout and slightly improved performance. So we're now replicating that with Randstad, and I think it'll replicate. But what I bring this up, David, because it's a tiny initiative that costs no money, that just uses people's brains differently, and it helps them embed flexibility and the unique value they bring and their best selves. It lets them embed that into the work. I mean, later on, we might talk about job crafting. It is a form of easy to do job crafting where they're not inventing a new rocket ship. They're still just actually doing the work, but they're doing the work in a way that they think adds the most value based on their skills. So I've been really excited about doing that work. That's
fantastic. Yeah, that's fantastic work. And it's encouraging. In some ways, it's trusting themselves and being more trusting in others to do it. Because in some ways, it sounds incredibly intuitive to say, really focus on what matters and cut out the distractions and do the deep work. I don't criticize the approach, but in some ways you think it's highly intuitive and quite a lot of common sense, but it requires a huge amount of trust.
Somehow that's it.
And it links to the point about this return to the office, not return to work. People have been working in the main. Return to the office. I think a lot of that is not just about the benefits of, creativity and serendipity and collaboration, which apparently typically happen in an office. Amazing how many successful startups have grown up remotely, by the way, just as an aside. But I think a lot of it is a lack of trust in some of the managers and leaders in the people, because they want to put their arms around them to see them and to see them working. Do you get that sense as well? Is trust an important ingredient in this?
It's such a good point, David. About 15 years ago, I did a paper with Kimberly Elsbach at the University of California. We looked at Facetime, and we looked at why it is that leaders liked it so much. And we learned there are two varieties. There's garden variety, which means, and we interviewed a lot of leaders and did this sort of empirics as well. Number one, the garden variety is leaders kind of just like to be able to look out over their people and be like, yes, they're working.
Yes.
It's almost like, if I can see you, then I don't have to trust you. It's a little why we use KPIs and controls as well, because when we scale up big firms, we can't know everyone and we can't trust everyone. So we can measure everyone, right? So I think that's garden variety. We also found this extracurricular type thing where when people are there quite early, when they're there quite late, when they're there on the weekends, those managers would admit that they saw those employees as superstars or as committed to the organization in an extraordinary way. And so they kind of use that FaceTime. Didn't matter if they're working, but they use the FaceTime as an index of who wants it, who's really in for this. And they wouldn't let us say their names, obviously, but they were actually willing to talk about how they kind of know that's wrong, but that's just the way it kind of works. And that is everything, as you said, David, it has everything to do with trust and kind of using that overcommitment, that FaceTime as a proxy for somebody I can trust.
Yeah. And it sort of suggests that they haven't figured out the results or the outcomes they want from the work, because and a sort of a signal of that is, time served or effort. And often you have to do great work. You have to put in the hours. I'm not suggesting you don't need to. Right. You have a lot of grit and perseverance and so on. But imagine if somebody just came up with a fantastic idea in an hour, right? And cracked through a problem. Would that person, and then by the way, they could go off and hang out with some friends and come back the next day and have another amazing day. I reckon in many traditional companies, that person would be considered a bit work shy, a bit sort of, are they really committed and so on. But anyway, let's just segue onto that point, because we have, on a more positive vein, we have seen many, leaders, genuine leaders, being more, if you like, compassionate, perhaps a bit more human, as they've obviously faced real human loss themselves and their family, and obviously the workforce. Or perhaps some of them had that sort of moments of more self-awareness of actually that perhaps there is a different way. In your conversations, do you get a sense there is a more permanent shift in the more human aspects, authentic aspects of leadership that we're seeing, even in the most successful, even mercenary organizations?
That's right. I can start off just by saying I hope so. I like you, it's hard to know how much of it is lip service. So they're all saying it. And there's even a lot of really good timbers around how there's a tension between sort of sharp feedback about performance and compassion, and how somehow we need to find a way to be honest, transparent, and even direct while being compassionate. Like some of the best ideas I've heard, the ones that I think will stick, David, are the ones where we're doing systems thinking about failure instead of trying to point a finger. You know, in my opinion, this is a way to be both honest, transparent, direct about performance, but compassionate about the human, and say, as leaders, how do we build an organization where an employee can't sink the ship, but we can all learn from new things?
Yes. Yeah.
That's when you said outcomes, like you made a really fun comment, a little dig, which was they haven't really worked out what outcomes they're looking for. One of the problems with coming up with outcomes is how fast the world changes.
Yes.
How you can say, we're going to want this in 3 months and we'll measure it this way, but in 2 months, the world's changed. And what's happened is employees have had to recoup, rethink, retool.
Yeah, it's a much more dynamic process. Yeah,
that's really hard.
And there's a lot more data coming through, real data.
That's real hard, because what you'd like to do is point the finger and say, you failed and you're the winner. The only thing is you learned a bunch of stuff, but it just didn't work out the way we planned. But you really helped us as an organization learn and grow. And then you hit your metrics, but like, we didn't want that anymore. I mean, you did the thing, but the thing isn't very useful anymore.
So there is a danger, right, of being overly focused on outcomes and the attribution.
David,
because in some organizations, and I won't name which, but you might guess, the game of demonstrating attribution to the outcome is one of the most important capabilities. What have you actually, when it's not clear how you've done it, or there isn't that trust in that systems-wide approach, that skill, and I know from my own experience, and you know the organization I'm talking about, that's really that's a really important skill. So you're hopeful that there's a shift.
Hopeful.
And it's it's not a trade-off then, that compassion point, and it's actually not a trade-off, it's a paradox. Actually, they do go hand in hand.
I'm really excited to use the word. I actually think it's one of those unbeatable tensions that just exist. And then what you do is you beat it by recognizing that you can't beat it. It's really interesting. That's the way a paradox works, is if you aren't seeing it as a paradox, you think you can beat it. So you kind of burn yourself out trying to get the balance right and perfect. And then you're frustrated because you can't get there. You'll never get there with a paradox, because it's not solvable. The solution is, how do we lead through it? And I think that's really exciting. And that's maybe not exactly what we want to speak about right now, but I will say that in the study that we're doing, the one that I told you about, and by the way, that's with Laura Gjerg. She's a postdoc student. And it's really very interesting what's happening, because what I think we're doing is, by giving people the chance to stare urgent and important in the face at the same time, and then negotiate through them, we're developing a paradox mindset. We're essentially developing a way of thinking about the work that I'll never be able to do all of what's urgent and what's important. So let me do the most important things that have to get done, and then the most important deep work that uses my personal skills. So I think maybe in a way that's what leaders are having to do right now, which is, I must be compassionate, and I must understand that the demands of yelling and pointing fingers probably won't result in better performance. It'll burn people out and make them go elsewhere. But at the same time, I actually need really good performance, because my peers, my competitors are really working hard. So to somehow manage those is, it's very complex.
It is. And it is a shift in mindset, because I think in many people I've or worked with when you use the word compassion, I think they'd say, if they're being a bit cynical, they'd say that's an HR thing, that's a culture thing, I'm the commercial person. Whereas if you work it through, actually, no, it's a mindset and actually a skill set of being compassionate. And actually, if you do it well, you can, and it's not an or, and you can deliver commercial success, or whatever success means for you in your organization. It's a bit like the other paradox I see and work through quite often with other executives is the topic of empowerment. Many organizations are now distributing responsibility from a more top-down bureaucratic model. And actually that comes with accountability. It's not just a free-for-all. But that's quite a mindset shift where you say to people, I empower you. And then often what defaults back to is, I'm going to micromanage you because I'm not sure
I'll be
you're
watching
the
in
right
case
person.
you don't do it the way I like it.
Yeah.
I want innovation, but it better freaking work.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right. I mean, what? Let's just move on to experiment. Well, you talked about experiments then. You talked about Upfield and your research study. I'm curious how you scale culture, if you like. So a lot of culture work is that culture change or evolution takes years, right? If not decades in many larger global organizations. You start with an experiment, you get some great results. How do you scale it? Because we sort of know what it shouldn't be. One end of the spectrum, there's a very military approach which says, here's a format, just take it across the organization, a bit like a TV series, right? It's worked in this country, take it across the world. It doesn't quite work with people. But similarly, you know that just showcasing great work and saying, hey, it worked in this division over here, why didn't you copy it? Or it doesn't quite work either. So where in the middle can you scale culture and scale it well?
As near as I can tell, it's this notion of pockets of excellence. As near as I can tell, doesn't mean I'm right, but I've thought about this so much. Here's what it seems like to me. It seems like the way great organizations are winning today are by activating that part of people's brains that make them want to learn, want to be curious, want to change. And in my one book, that's called The Seeking System. And I think, honestly, I believe in that stuff really deeply. So the problem is when you give people some empowerment in a certain little area, 50 people, 100 people, and you allow them to steer their own ship and chart their own course and do some innovation, they get kind of lit up on some dopamine, and they give extraordinary output. Leaders, managers are often surprised at how much they get out of people. Then when it works, as you say, they try to put posters up all around the firm and say, do it that way. But that doesn't activate that part of the brain in other people because you're not allowing them to invent and learn and play and try.
You're effectively saying, do it that way.
Then you're doing it that way. Well, that's the same as top down. Then all of a sudden it's like hierarchy and you're doing it to me. It's like when change is done by me, I get inspired. When it's done to me, I get debilitated, and that's magical to be able to manage through the excitement and the trying new things and the ownership of a new idea, but in many pockets that are sharing information, but not demanding that you do it the way we did it. That's really hard. So when I say this notion of pockets of innovation or pockets of excellence, my idea is that there are some tools or some general procedures or some ideas about direction, but there isn't a you must do it this way. Did you ever hear about TD Canada Trust? Did you ever hear about, this is about 5-6 years ago now, but they did a really cool thing, and I've seen this in a lot of different places. What leadership thought about is, we have to start improving our reputation in the local environment. We need local community members to look at a bank, us, and say, we respect you, we trust you.
Yes.
So what they did is they gave all the bank branches 40,000 Canadian dollars. And they said, what we need you to do, the frame here, is build these community relationships. The freedom is each of you can do it the way you want to do it. And so there's a lot of...
And did they set a target? I'm not a big target person, so they gave them the funding and they gave them the overall ambition. But how specific were they, if you remember?
Don't know. Let me tell you, this is like sort of full reveal. I don't work with them at all. I'm just starting to create a little video case, because what I did is they made a lot of those into great little videos you can go watch. Some of them watched 25 million times. They've made quite a splash. Some of the bank branches just did little things, like they just gave the money to a local charity, a kids charity, and then the members went and volunteered and they made that into a little film. Other ones, like 5 bank branches got together and built a piece of tech where the people came to get their money, but they got little personalized gifts. And it went viral and blah, blah, blah. There's so many that, but what I liked about it is the huge variance in what the firms did with the money, what the individual branches did with the money. And that meant that as an organization, they got to watch and see what are the different ways that we could connect with the local community, rather than say, we've sorted it. Now we're going to have a culture of community orientation.
And then if you then link it to a few other things, that really, I think, plays well against, playing to people's strengths, which are different by their nature, but it's more inclusive and so forth. As opposed
localized.
to this, localized, and frankly, the engagement and I guess the commitment is this is crafted by me. I know what the overall aim is, but actually I've got the freedom and creativity to do it my way.
Even
That's
though you
fantastic.
just said it there, David, it creates a personalized sense of purpose because we came up with this plan and then tried it out. So all of a sudden I'm leaning in. I want to see if it's going to work. I've got skin in the game. It's just so interesting how as soon as you, the boss, tell me that I have to go and do that and then it's like, I'll do it because it's my job. But like when it doesn't work, you're the one with the dumb idea. It's kind of, you're not owning it like an entrepreneur, you're doing it like a worker. And it's really very interesting to try to manage through the whole organization, like the words used, scale that up. That is, it's a magical thing. And I don't think there's like a recipe other than to say we need to activate that part of the brain locally, but we need to have community direction. We need to have like concerted effort toward one goal.
And one of the big skills there is the ability to hold back as somebody, as the manager, because we're all programmed to sort of do stuff. But actually in that case, the holding back must be, hey, I sort of know the recipe, or I think I know the recipe from somewhere. It's worked elsewhere really well. I've got to just tell you that's the production line sort of mentality. Whereas the skill is to say that may work, it may not, but actually let's give them a chance. And actually they might do it their own way and it might even be better, which is quite a bit mindset shift. But that's holding back and sort of just standing back and trusting the people to do good work.
And even for it to fail. I mean, this is what's so painful with our kids the same. Sometimes one of the hardest things to say, that's their lesson to learn. I mean, I can tell them, but it's not going to sink in that if they go ahead. There's David, there's that whole thing about above the waterline and below the waterline, that whole thing. It's like you need, as a leader, to be able to understand that that is a mistake we can afford to fix. That's a mistake that sinks the ship. How do I get involved? When do I get involved? These are the things that business school professors don't know. They don't teach us and we don't teach.
But if you imagine, in your classroom and your conversations or keynotes, you have a conversation with somebody who's been in an organization for a long time. Let's just pick on the traditional incumbent global organizations, whichever sector, whichever country. And they have good intent in the way we've just been talking about, but they have a fear, which is, I've never tried it before. Failure's been penalized. So I like the idea of that empowerment, giving people the opportunity to shape it, maybe giving people to shape their own careers, that job crafting you referred to earlier. So they want to do it, but they have this fear. How can they make the first step? How can they make the first step?
And this is a specific leader that's trying to create that culture of psychological safety and so on.
Yeah.
Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
So I think the first thing, these are some things that are out there that when people learn, try to share it as learning and not failure or punishment. That's a huge piece of this. That's the whole cat fur thing in some ways from Alive at Work. It's, you really have to find ways to share learning without people feeling penalized. If people think they're going to get burnt for learning, they're going to stop learning. And we all can say that rationally now, but it gets hard when the mistakes are actually made. Yes. To get people in a room. I mean, listen, I can tell you what you should do. I think it's just hard, but you get people in the room and you say, okay, what did we learn from that? What types of mistakes did we make that we can now fix for next time? Did we get close to the waterline? And do we understand, do we agree on where the waterline is?
Yes.
You use phrases like, we need to be working on the airplane while we're still flying it. That's this idea that we can't afford to stop and fix the organization and then take off again. We have to constantly be upgrading as we go if we want to stay relevant. You know what I mean? If we want to become resilient and stay relevant, we can't afford to not be learning. But I think that saying that again, as a professor, and saying that in a logical kind of way, we all can nod our head and say learning cultures are really important for adaptability and so on. But when there are KPIs, there are metrics, and bonuses are on the line, and raises are on the line, and limited promotions are on the line, as you know, and I know, people get very personal very quickly.
Yes.
And I think that's when you kill a culture of innovation and kill a culture of learning versus fan the flames on that culture of innovation. Yeah,
I agree. Sorry, you want to carry on?
I'm musing in my own brain right now about, number one, these are really good questions. And number two, how very frustrating it would be if you were the kind of leader that just wanted the playbook. Like, just tell me how to do this.
Yes, yes.
What's the formula? Like, where's the algorithm?
But that happens, Dan. So that happens all the time, and it's in good intent. Where you get an organization, they hear of a great case study, probably from a professor. He says cheekily, and they say, "I want to hear the playbook from X," and it's normally West Coast US, increasingly Chinese as well, right, and Far Eastern, and they say, "Hey, they've done X well." Different context, leadership, capital structure, lots of differences, and they say we want to immerse ourselves in it, people get awakened, enthused. Wow, couldn't we do that? And then in some ways, I am being a bit provocative here. In some ways, it's worse because you've woken people up, and then the time and effort is spent on the illumination, the exploration, and so on, the learning. And then by the time you sort of finished, you're exhausted. And then you go back to, okay, so how do we translate that into our own context? And that's the hardest bit. And that's the hardest bit where people say, oh gosh, there's so much inertia, there's so much difficulty, and so on. So you shouldn't stop that exploration, but it's a bit like building a house. You forget the foundations and some of the, and you sort of go straight to the the new stuff and the fancy new furniture, and you actually don't work out how do you actually move in properly or transition towards it.
Yeah, there's so many good little nuggets in there. Do you want to ask another question?
Let's do that.
We're just
that's good feedback. I was taking your sort of moment just to sort of muse and explore in my own way. Habits. Let's talk about habits, because that's the theme and the topic you cover in your brilliant book. And you talk about obviously crafting your life and work as sort of separate chapters within that, and that particularly resonates with me, and indeed your own story and stories throughout your life. And you talk about 66 days and the practice of journaling. So the reason I raise that is I work with quite a lot of people in their 40s, 50s, and 60s who are looking to create a different form of life, anchored around work. I'm not a life coach, but anchored around work. They still want to be exceptional at work, whatever work means, but they want to, if you like, leave less collateral damage to themselves and to their families. So they're trying to craft a new work and life, and it requires a lot of unlearning and a lot of leaps of faith on their part to do it. And I was just intrigued by some of the exercises and practice in the 66 days. So
you gotta love 66.
Tell us a bit more about that.
Well, I love it because these scientists at UCL worked out for real, using statistics, how long it takes to habituate a new behavior. And that might be quite a simple behavior, like drinking 4 glasses of water a day, doing 30 push-ups when you first wake up in the morning, going for a 50-minute walk some point during the day, some new habit that you want to change. What they learned is when you first start doing it, it feels uncomfortable and awkward and hard to fit in the schedule, and there's just no time, and it feels weird, and it's not me. But then after a week, you start to understand, if you can stay with it, that it's possible. And after 3 weeks, you start to not quite miss it if you don't have it, but it's starting to feel comfortable. And then on average, at 66 days, you kind of are in the new normal. It is a habit in the sense that it doesn't feel weird, awkward, uncomfortable. It feels like something I do now. Yes. Now, those are quite simple behaviors, David. I like it though because 66 days gets people's attention. It's just a way of being like, there's a number. Now, for a very complex set of behaviors, like for instance, being a better partner, being a better parent, these types of, you have to script the behaviors you want to change first. You have to think not about being a better parent, but at the point that my child does learn something new, is my response anger or curiosity? And really bake it at the level of, here's sometimes I haven't been happy with my response. Let me try to steer it toward it. That, I don't think that's 66 days.
No, that's hard work. I'm saying to myself as I'm
66 events, but it doesn't happen every day, does it? So in a weird way, it might take a year of that hard work till it becomes the new you. But still, it's interesting that the ideas work. The idea of you go from awkward to confident in a new behavior, but it kind of gets harder before it gets easier.
Yes, yes.
I love that stuff, by the way. I love it so much. And it just butts right up against the growth mindset stuff, which we've touched on a little bit already. It goes right up against the idea that, oh, this discomfort, that's probably good for me. Let me be curious about why I'm not comfortable with that. Let me make sure that that discomfort is actually taking me toward where I want to go, and then just slog through that struggle, much like running up a hill. You know what I mean? Or like using the rower machine. That's not fun either, but then that's how you get stronger.
But that's the point, right? That there should be and will be moments where you feel discomfort, and because you're trying to change something that you baked in, and a bit like some of your work elsewhere in the book, where you talk about doing too much with your strengths. Yeah. And I'm a big fan of my own work and research of trying to tackle conventional wisdom or test the limits of perceived wisdom, where strengths-based revolution and every organization should be based on strengths. Well, that doesn't quite work practically. And so your challenge is, okay, play to your strengths. And you use the example when you go out to dinner with your partner, being an extrovert, play to your strengths, but think actually more about the impact you want to have. And so that's an example of what
I'm really happy that you brought that up. And I think that the idea of trying to stretch into your strengths to create the impact that you want to create is the sort of answer to it. I think that often gets lost in that first brush with this that leaders have, which is play to your strengths. What about when strengths become weaknesses? What about Achilles' heels when you overuse them? And that can happen. It's not as though that's a fictitious creature. That happens quite a bit, in fact. If you're really good at your forehand, you forget to practice your backhand. Guess where they're going to beat you? that it really is that way. But the idea of thinking about the effect that you're trying to create, and then look for ways to kind of stretch into your strengths. But that doesn't mean we don't have to keep learning and growing.
Absolutely.
With your podcast, if you're like me at all, 3 years ago, we weren't doing podcasts. I thought in my own world, that was an impact that I wanted to learn about. I wanted to see if I could make. And when I tried to use my strengths to get there, it showed me a lot of limitations, a lot of weaknesses. It showed me
know that feeling.
Yes, exactly. And so what happens though is by trying to stretch into your strengths, you reveal your weaknesses. Yes. It's trying to make a bigger impact. You're like, oh my, I need to fix that. I need to get better at that if I want to create that. So for me, while we can overuse our strengths, if you use this impact way of thinking, it takes us to a better solution.
Yes, it sort of helps you get over the natural stubbornness that some people might have. And I know a number of people who sort of say, well, I'm playing to my strengths, and this sort of stubbornness kicks in. And then there's sort of the lack of coherence then comes to if they're in an organization to, well, I'm really good at this. It's like, well, you may be really good at this, but the organization values something different. So you face a choice as to, do you learn some new tricks or do you actually find a new place for those strengths? But let's keep on this habit theme and let's talk about you. So let's just think about one of your key moments, critical moments in your work life. It could be doing some research, as you alluded to earlier. It could be doing some teaching, some keynote, giving a keynote. It could be writing. Let's just pick one of those. Keep it in your head. It's no magic trick, by the way, but it's like I'm a magician. Keep one of those moments in your head and think about two things. And I'd welcome you. One is, what is the one or two habits that helps you do, and I mean this sincerely, exceptional work? I'm a big fan of yours.
Well,
and secondly, what have you changed in terms of your habits and the way you just described, perhaps over the last year?
Yeah. Well, let me give you two, and I'm going to right now do it in the sort of keynote space. When we went digital, when I had to start doing keynotes digitally, I wasn't comfortable with it. I just felt awkward. My legs were locking. My throat went dry the first 3 or 4. And I expect a lot out of myself, and my clients expect a lot out of me. And what I was feeling, for example, was I wasn't able to push my emotion into the camera. I felt awkward, and I think that was coming through. I didn't know where to talk. Like right now, I'm looking in this camera. It's a little bit of a thing I had to learn because you're there. So if I was talking to you, and that this sounds little, but I only have an hour to create quite an impact, And so I very recently had to work through quite a struggle because I see this as one of the things I love doing and I want to create a great impact. And I wasn't. I actually got fairly for me, bad feedback. It was mediocre. It was tepid feedback. And I was just becoming really unhappy with how the world had shifted away from me in a way I couldn't control. It made my job less good for me. You know, it's hard for me to get much emotion back from the camera, but it's also very hard for me to be good at my job and push it out. So I think practicing. I probably did, 35 or 40 before I really started almost wanting this, while I still prefer to be in a room, I'll say that honestly.
Yes.
There's something about digital that I can use now. And it has to do with like being able to control almost everything and be able to know when, like, I'll watch the comments and I'll pick when I want to bring it up just at the right moment. Yes. Or if I want to show one figure. Second thing that I could tell you about, but I'm not going to go down, is I'm trying to do talks without slides anymore. Mm-hmm. And I'm learning that it releases me to give more value. Whereas I used to be afraid that I might get lost. I used it as I guess you'd say a crutch in a way.
Yeah, many of us do. Yeah.
And so now it's pretty much a no slides or just a one.
So you're challenging some of the assumptions on how you worked and actually using the new platform you're having to use and trying to play it genuinely to your strengths. Sounds like hard work. Yeah.
I've loved it. I mean, to be honest, having to live through my own struggles and eat my own dog food around these ideas of habit formation and so on, it's been really healthy for me. It's been really good.
One of the things I admire, many things I admire about you, Dan, is that you talk about your genuine struggles professionally and or personally. You link it obviously to illustrate a point from your research, but many people hide behind a mask of perfection.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean you have to disclose everything. There's conscious choices about how much and how, in what form and when to disclose. But I admire the fact because that deepens the connection that we have with you.
Somehow it builds a trust.
And builds trust and actually illustrates the points far more. But let me leave you this last question, because you touched upon impact just a moment ago. And if you think about your impact, not that you're going anywhere, but if you think about your impact as a researcher, as a teacher, an author, what impact do you look for and what would you like to be known for?
Yeah, well, the easiest answer is trying to help people put more living into life. That's the thing that I love it in the work context, because we spend so many of our hours at work. So if we can light up work, and I don't mean 24 hours, 7 days a week, we love what we do, but I just mean 10%, 15% noticeable difference in work feeling like it's really me. I call that impact priceless and humanistic and, frankly, almost a calling. While I'm not a religious person, to me, that feels like the most important thing that I can do. Wonderful. And I'd say that along with that is trying to wake people up to life, including myself. It's easy to fall into a rut. That phrase, sometimes the groove becomes a rut. And I try to catch myself and other people before that happens. Once you're in the rut, it's remarkably hard to stop sleepwalking. And by the way, this is a full circle round. I believe that this is part of what COVID, if there's an upside, if there's a silver lining, I think that's one of them, which is it really has been life smacking us in the face and saying, wake up, you sure you're doing this right? And a lot of people are changing jobs right now for that reason. A lot of people are trying to do their jobs differently for that reason, because they're looking and saying, I kind of like being home with my family a little bit more. I don't really need that commute. Doing that didn't add much value. I'm doing my job great without that. And I think that we're all questioning instead of sleepwalking.
Yes, that really is an awakening. I agree. Dan, I love talking with you. I love learning from you. Love riffing off you. Where can people find out more about you and your work?
Dan-cable.com has all my stuff and some talks and that sort of thing. And I do love the book Exceptional. I actually haven't looked to see how it's selling. I've put my heart into that, and I know that it works. That's all evidence-based. That isn't just my research. That's decades of acres.
I've read it many times, and it's quite rare for me to read a book many times. It has stories, genuine stories, a range of different examples, really practical exercises, and it's which I've used, have been using.
So have I, David. So have I. I really have.
And it's a joy to read. It's beautifully written, so I heartily recommend it. Thank you for your time today, Dan. So that was another edition of Lanceville on the Line. Please sign up to the podcast, the YouTube channel, for more updates, and do check out other great interviews in this series. Thanks for listening.
Great to see you.